Hello, what is up, everybody? And welcome to Casual Comic Fans, where the setting is casual, but the fans are not. I'm Mike from Comic Book Fans, and today we are going to be reviewing Black Widow. I will say before we start, this is a spoiler review, so if you've seen the movie, great. If you have not, proceed at your own risk. Alright, so I gotta say before we start this that because of where this movie falls in the timeline, like it technically comes between Civil War and Infinity War, but it actually, the movie is released obviously after Endgame, so we already know Black Widow died. So the movie itself kind of loses a bit of the suspense. You know Natasha isn't going to die, and you know Yelena isn't going to die because she's going to be the next Black Widow, so you really don't have any fear or anxiety or suspense over whether they're going to make it through this movie or not. But I think this movie, having it released after Endgame, it does gain the emotional weight of Natasha dying. So this movie did kind of have the opportunity to use this as a kind of a memorial to Natasha, which in some ways it did, but not really, but we'll talk about that later. Let's just start with the good. Or the pros. First off, this movie I think really was a lot more dark and intense in some respects than I expected. This movie started out really intense and unique, like the whole like title sequence where, you know, it's set to some weird rendition of Smells Like Teen Spirit, and, you know, we get to see kind of what was going on in the Red Room a little bit, you know, and then there are a lot of other themes in the movie that they bring up, like basically all these girls being kidnapped by this bad guy and being brainwashed and becoming assassins kind of against their will, and, you know, also being forced to be sterilized basically. In some ways this movie did a good job at tackling these subjects, in a lot of ways they didn't, but we'll get to that later. But I also really enjoyed that a lot of this movie felt like kind of like a spy movie. Like I was watching this thinking, you know, this gives me a lot of Jason Bourne vibes, you know, so I really did enjoy that aspect to it. It's very unique for an MCU film, though I felt like it kind of stopped being that way about halfway through the movie and kind of became more of a typical MCU movie. And I will say the acting, very good. Pretty much everybody did a really good job. Some of the accents were a little shaky, but that's, you know, a little nitpicky. I think everybody overall did a really good job acting, especially Florence Pugh. And speaking of her, her character, Yelena Belova, was definitely a very welcome newcomer. I did kind of expect to like her, but I didn't expect to like her as much as I did. At the beginning of the movie, she's a little abrasive, but by the end, you really like her, and I really look forward to seeing her in future projects like the Hawkeye movie. I will say there are aspects to this movie, there are definitely some emotional themes to this movie, and, you know, because ultimately this movie is about, if you don't believe me, just look at this.
Family.
Now, that being said, you know, there are a few scenes that I think really hit home. You know, I think in some respects, this movie does feel like, you know, a movie about family, more so than I expected it to be in the trailers. I expected it to be a little bit more forced than it was, especially the relationship between Yelena and Natasha. That really felt genuine, like they really were kind of sisters. And I did feel, you know, more of a family dynamic, even though it was like a fake family. Though I think there are some scenes where the emotional depth kind of gets cut short, but again, we'll talk about that in the cons section. Also, I think another really cool thing is the fight scenes. A lot of the MCU fight scenes feel very choreographed, and like there's not a whole lot of weight to them because, you know, oh, it's just two stuntmen fighting basically at the end of the day. But this movie, a lot of the fight scenes felt a lot more intense, and like people are actually getting hurt. Like people are like, this punch is actually breaking somebody's nose, or, you know, stuff like that. Like this kick to the head is gonna cause a concussion. You know, there were a lot of scenes like that I was like, okay, this is actually like feels like there's weight to these punches, to these hits, which we don't always see in the MCU movies. Now on to some of the not so great parts. So, like I said, this movie kind of falls apart a little bit when it comes to the emotional depth, which is weird because they bring up a lot of emotional depth, and then they, in some scenes, they sort of throw it against the wall. There are a few scenes like between David Harbour's Red Guardian and Florence Pugh's Yelena Belova, and there are some scenes that are really good between them and even with the other family members, and then in some respects, I feel like they really cut the scene short and don't really, like they have these major revelations or really intense themes they bring up, and they don't really let the scene have time to breathe. They either break it up with comedy, or they sort of like jump to the next scene, have like an explosion or an action scene or something. So you never really get the chance to process, you know, something that they just brought up that's pretty intense. You know, like say when Red Guardian and Yelena were talking, and then he starts singing American Pie, and it was kind of a sweet scene, and then it just sort of gets interrupted abruptly.
I'm dying.
Oh my god. I choked on air. That scene gets interrupted by, you know, the Red Room people showing up. It's like the filmmakers didn't quite know how to end some of these more emotionally deep scenes. There was even like kind of too much humor in some parts, like when they were talking about the forced hysterectomy that Yelena had to go through. Instead of like making this like kind of an emotionally deep scene, like we did see this in Age of Ultron. Considering the subject matter, it was handled a lot better, honestly, in that movie. In this movie, Yelena starts joking about it and saying like they took out my ovaries and chopped up my uterus and all this stuff. Is like honestly a little like the way they're talking about this really serious thing so lightly. There are a few scenes like that. Also, there are quite a few scenes where Natasha survives ridiculously dangerous situations, like several explosions, several car crashes where she just comes out with like without a scratch. She's like invincible. But now to the villains, which in my opinion were really bad. The main villain, General Dreykov, he wasn't really set up well. Like they basically like introduced him in this movie and acted like, you know, he was kind of like the source of basically every bad thing that happened to Natasha. But there was a lot of like tell don't show, like a lot of people talking about how terrible he was, but I think it would have hit better if they had shown more of him earlier in the movie and shown how terrible he really was. Pretty much his main role in the movie was just kind of to sit back in his office and explain to Natasha all the bad things he's done, you know? And then we got the Taskmaster. For those of you who don't know, Taskmaster is kind of a pretty badass character in the comics. Like, he's sort of like the Deathstroke of the Marvel Universe. Like, not really, because that's technically Deadpool. And also Prometheus is more like Taskmaster, because he's able to copy everybody's moves as well. But he's similar to Deathstroke in that he's just a really cool character, but also that he's like kind of a contract killer mercenary. So with this movie, the main issue wasn't even really the gender swap, which was kind of weird. And even the fact that they made Taskmaster General Dreykov's daughter. It's the fact that they basically made Taskmaster a mindless drone for the main villain, which is not Taskmaster at all. We did get to see Taskmaster do some cool copying of, you know, some of the Avengers powers, but we kind of already saw all of them in the trailers already, so there wasn't any scene where I was like, whoa, that's cool, because I kind of seen it already. So it's like they kind of ruined that with the trailers. Definitely not a good There's honestly a better adaptation of Taskmaster in the Avengers video game and the Spider-Man video game. Heck, the Spider-Man cartoons, you know? But, you know, who knows? We're finally getting a somewhat comic-accurate Mandarin this year, so maybe just wait, 10 years or so. Maybe then we'll actually get real Taskmaster. I wish they had shown more of Natasha's like origin, and I really wish they had at least one scene where they actually show her and Hawkeye, like how they met and all that stuff, because I know at this point we're never going to get that. They've been teasing this since 2012 when they were talking about Budapest for half the movie, and we get in like references to it in this movie, but we never actually get to see it. I feel like, considering we had to wait like almost 10 years to actually see anything about Budapest, all we really got was just more talking about it. I feel like this movie would have been kind of better if it were like at least half showing her origin, actually showing it, not talking about it, and showing how she joined S.H.I.E.L.D. and everything. Kind of a halfway origin movie. And then maybe the other half have like, you know, a present day adventure or, you know, a few years ago adventure, but that's just me. And speaking of emotional scenes, the only time they really had a sort of memorial for Natasha, they didn't even really have one at Endgame. They finally have one kind of at the end of this when Yelena visited her grave. But that scene was ruined by Julia Louis-Dreyfus's character, Valentina Allegra de Fontaine, who basically just showed up and started making jokes, which is like, this is basically the only time we've had to like mourn Natasha's death in the entire MCU, and we're gonna start joking halfway through it. So like, I know they're setting stuff up, but that scene felt really out of place. And last but not least, I also think that they underutilized some of the characters, especially David Harbour's Red Guardian, because they really, at the beginning of the movie, he's a really like serious and interesting character, and they even set him up as sort of like the anti-Captain America, and like they make jokes about it the whole movie. He's even like in the suit, but every time he has a chance to have a really cool scene, he doesn't get it. Like he gets shot with tranq darts, or Taskmaster just beats the ever-living crap out of him without him even really being able to land a punch. I know he's the like comedic, the comic relief for this movie, which David Harbour did great with that, but they also could have had some cool scenes with him, and instead he's just like a bumbling moron the whole movie. He didn't even get one scene where you're like, wow, he's really cool. I think they really underutilized him. But maybe we'll see him in the future and he'll have his time to shine, hopefully.
But now, time for the verdict.
I would give this movie a 6.8 out of 10. Ultimately, I think Black Widow does bring some new things to the MCU and has some really interesting and unique aspects to it. But at the same time, it falls into the same traps that a lot of other MCU movies do, like too much joking, not really committing to any of the emotionally deep scenes. Probably mid-tier Marvel, I would say. You know, it's enjoyable, but has a lot of problems with it. Still a good time, though. Gotta say. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. If you liked that, hit like and subscribe. And be sure to check out our podcast, our social media, Instagram, Facebook group, all that stuff. Links in the description. And I will see you later. Peace out.